Sometimes the quietest warning is the only thing standing between success and a mistake that can never be undone. Ethan Caldwell had signed agreements worth billions of dollars without his hand trembling once. But on that crisp October afternoon in Manhattan, as sunlight poured through the towering glass walls of the Grand Lexington Hotel's Executive Conference Center, something invisible was about to stop the most confident businessman in the room. 12 executives sat around the polished walnut table, their tailored suits flawless, their leather portfolios neatly aligned, every face carrying the calm certainty that accompanies enormous wealth. Cameras from several financial publications waited outside the closed doors, eager to capture the historic merger expected to reshape an entire industry before the closing bell on Wall Street. Every minute had been planned. Every signature had been rehearsed. Every detail had been verified by attorneys whose hourly fees exceeded what many Americans earned in a month. Ethan adjusted the silver cuff beneath the sleeve of his navy suit and glanced toward the final page resting before him. The fountain pen waiting beside the contract had been a retirement gift from his late father, a simple reminder that every signature represented a promise before it represented profit. Across the table, Victor Harlan, CEO of Northbridge Technologies, smiled with polished confidence. Beside him, attorneys exchanged subtle nods while assistants quietly organized folders, tablets, and financial reports. The atmosphere carried the familiar scent of expensive coffee, fresh paper, and restrained ambition. Everything appeared perfect, almost too perfect. 40 minutes earlier, while the conference room buzzed with introductions and polite conversation, Claire Bennett had been arranging porcelain coffee cups on a polished serving cart in the hotel kitchen below. At 27, she had worked at the Grand Lexington for nearly 3 years, earning a reputation for remembering every guest's preferences without writing a single note. Most executives never noticed her beyond asking for another refill. That suited Claire just fine. Invisible. People heard things others ignored. They noticed pauses between conversations, expressions that flashed for only a heartbeat, documents left carelessly open for a second too long. Her co-workers joked that she possessed the eyes of a detective and the patience of a librarian. Claire simply smiled and kept working. As she guided the serving cart toward the executive floor, she passed 2 assistants whispering anxiously near the elevator. One sentence drifted into the hallway before they noticed her approaching. "He'll never read every page." They immediately fell silent. Claire kept walking without reacting, though the words quietly settled into the back of her mind. Minutes later, she entered conference room A with practiced grace, offering warm smiles while placing steaming cups beside each guest. No one stopped discussing stock values, acquisition forecasts, or international expansion. She became part of the furniture, moving silently from chair to chair. Ethan barely looked up when she refreshed his coffee, his attention fixed on a highlighted section of the agreement while 3 attorneys discussed regulatory language. Claire continued around the room until she reached Victor's side. As she leaned forward to place a fresh cup near his folder, one loose page shifted ever so slightly beneath the air from the serving tray. It exposed a single paragraph highlighted in pale yellow. Claire's eyes caught only one sentence before the paper settled back into place. She froze for less than a second. The wording felt strangely familiar, not because she understood corporate law, but because years ago she had watched someone lose everything after overlooking language almost identical to those few carefully arranged lines. Her heartbeat remained steady even as a quiet unease spread through her thoughts. She finished serving every guest without changing her expression. Around the table, conversation resumed with effortless confidence. Laughter returned. Pens were uncapped. Chairs shifted closer. The countdown toward the signature had begun. Ethan reached for the final document while every executive leaned forward with satisfied anticipation. Claire stood beside the coffee cart near the exit, watching in complete silence. Then, just as Ethan lowered his father's fountain pen toward the signature line, she noticed one tiny detail no one else seemed to see. The polished conference room continued humming with quiet confidence, but Claire Bennett no longer heard the conversation around her. Her attention stayed fixed on that single sentence she had glimpsed beneath Victor Harlan's folder. She could not remember every word, yet the structure of the clause echoed inside her mind with uncomfortable clarity. It reminded her of another room years earlier, another table covered with contracts, and another person who had believed every page had already been checked. Claire slowly wheeled the coffee cart toward the side wall, pretending to organize cream pitchers and sugar packets while carefully watching the people gathered around the table. Everyone appeared relaxed except one attorney sitting near Victor. Unlike the others, he never smiled. His fingers tapped lightly against a leather folder every few seconds, and each glance he made drifted toward the signature page rather than Ethan Caldwell himself. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Claire had spent years learning that nervous people often revealed themselves through habits they never realized they had. She noticed another detail. Every executive had a printed copy of the agreement except Ethan. His version contained several colored tabs placed neatly along the edge, suggesting it had been prepared separately. Perhaps it meant nothing. Perhaps it meant everything. Claire lowered her eyes and quietly collected 2 empty cups. She reminded herself that she was a waitress, not an attorney. She had no business questioning documents worth billions of dollars. Still, the feeling refused to disappear. It settled deeper, becoming heavier with every passing second. Across the room, Ethan listened patiently as one attorney summarized the final legal review. The explanation sounded polished, almost rehearsed. Every sentence ended with reassuring phrases. Standard procedure. Routine language. Industry practice. No unusual risks. Ethan had heard those same words hundreds of times throughout his career. He trusted systems because systems had helped build everything he owned. Trusting experts had always been part of his success. Yet even he felt something unusual in the room that afternoon, though he could not explain why. Perhaps it was simply the pressure surrounding such an enormous transaction. Perhaps it was exhaustion after weeks of negotiations. He adjusted his father's fountain pen between his fingers and glanced toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Yellow taxis moved like tiny pieces across the streets below, while autumn sunlight reflected from neighboring skyscrapers. The city looked steady, predictable, ordered. Inside the conference room, appearances suggested exactly the same. Claire quietly approached another table to replace a water pitcher. As she reached for the glass bottle, she overheard 2 junior associates speaking so softly they assumed no one could hear. "Once he signs, everything changes," one whispered. The other answered with a nervous laugh. "That is the idea." They immediately stopped talking as Claire stepped closer. She offered a polite smile that revealed nothing and continued her work. Those 8 simple words tightened the unease already growing inside her. Everything changes. She had heard similar words before. They were often spoken by people celebrating opportunities while someone else unknowingly carried the cost. Claire carefully returned the empty pitcher to her serving cart. A memory surfaced without invitation. Years earlier, her father had walked into their small Ohio home, carrying a cardboard box filled with framed photographs and office supplies. He had smiled as though everything would somehow be all right. Only months later had Claire discovered that one overlooked paragraph inside a partnership agreement had quietly transferred control of the family business away from him. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Just one signature and a future that disappeared behind legal language almost no ordinary person could understand. That experience had taught Claire something no classroom ever could. The most expensive mistakes rarely looked dangerous until they were irreversible. She blinked away the memory and looked back toward Ethan. His pen was now resting above the final page. Every conversation around the table gradually faded into respectful silence. Cameras outside the conference room prepared for the announcement. Assistants straightened their jackets. Attorneys exchanged satisfied nods. Victor Harlan folded his hands together with calm confidence. But for the briefest instant, Claire noticed his eyes flick toward the signature line instead of Ethan's face. It lasted less than a heartbeat. That single glance made her decision for her. Claire Bennett had spent years teaching herself one simple rule. If everyone in the room believed something was obvious, look at the one thing nobody was paying attention to. She kept her breathing slow as she lifted another porcelain cup from the silver tray, giving herself one more excuse to remain inside the conference room. Her heartbeat stayed steady, but her thoughts moved quickly. She was no attorney, and she certainly had no authority to interrupt executives whose combined fortunes could buy entire city blocks. Yet authority had never guaranteed wisdom. She had learned that lesson long ago. Ethan Caldwell lowered his eyes toward the final page again, while one of the senior attorneys slid the document a fraction of an inch closer to him. "Whenever you are ready, Mr. Caldwell," the attorney said with an easy smile. Victor Harlan mirrored the expression, folding his hands together with practiced patience. Around the table, every executive appeared relaxed. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others quietly checked messages on their tablets, convinced the difficult part of the day had already passed. Claire noticed something else. Nobody looked at the contract anymore. They all looked at Ethan's pen. The signature had become inevitable in everyone's mind. That certainty unsettled her more than anything else. She carefully stepped toward Ethan's side to refill his coffee. The rich aroma drifted gently across the table as she poured without spilling a single drop. Ethan barely acknowledged her presence. Offering the automatic nod, he gave every member of the hotel staff. Claire placed the coffee pot back onto the tray, but instead of immediately stepping away, her eyes caught one tiny reflection in the polished tabletop. The final page had shifted slightly beneath Ethan's hand. The paragraph she had glimpsed earlier was now partially visible again. This time she read enough to understand why her instincts had refused to stay quiet. The wording did not transfer ownership directly. It transferred temporary emergency authority under conditions defined elsewhere in the agreement. Those conditions referred to another section buried dozens of pages earlier. Claire did not know exactly what the legal consequence would be, but she recognized the structure immediately. Her father had signed something frighteningly similar. The language sounded harmless because it was written to sound harmless. She slowly straightened her posture. Her mind argued with itself. "Stay silent. This is not your place. The attorneys know more than you ever will." But another voice answered just as firmly. People who assume someone else has already checked everything are often the ones who regret it later. Ethan lifted the fountain pen. The polished black barrel reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Every pair of eyes followed the movement. Outside the conference room, camera shutters clicked in anticipation. An assistant quietly reached for the door handle, preparing to invite reporters inside the moment the signatures were complete. Claire looked around the room one final time. She searched every face, hoping someone else would notice what she had seen. No one did. Victor Harlan remained perfectly composed, but his right thumb rubbed lightly across the edge of his wedding band again and again. The silent attorney beside him stopped tapping his fingers altogether. Even his breathing appeared shallower now. They were waiting, not for discussion, for ink. Claire understood that another 5 seconds might change everything. She took one careful step forward. Her shoes made almost no sound against the thick carpet. Ethan's pen hovered less than an inch above the signature line. He never looked up. Claire leaned forward just enough that only he could hear her voice. It was calm, respectful, barely louder than a breath. "Do not sign here." The words seemed to disappear into the quiet air before anyone else noticed them. Ethan's hand stopped instantly. The pen remained suspended above the paper. He did not write a single letter. For the first time that afternoon, complete silence filled the conference room. Even the distant sound of traffic outside seemed to vanish. Ethan slowly turned his head toward Claire. There was no panic in her eyes, no dramatic expression, only quiet certainty. Around the table, confusion spread from one face to another as executives exchanged uncertain glances, unable to understand why the billionaire had suddenly frozen only a heartbeat before the signature that everyone believed was inevitable. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt long enough for every person around the table to sense that something had shifted. Ethan Caldwell did not lower his pen. He did not sign. Instead, he studied Claire Bennett with the same careful attention he normally reserved for quarterly reports and acquisition proposals. Her expression remained composed. She was not asking for attention. She was not trying to impress anyone. She simply stood beside the coffee cart with both hands resting lightly against the polished handle, waiting without fear and without apology. Victor Harlan was the first to recover. A polite laugh escaped his lips as he leaned back in his chair. "I believe there has been some misunderstanding," he said pleasantly. "Perhaps the young lady is concerned about serving coffee while we are finishing business." A few nervous smiles appeared around the table, but they disappeared almost immediately when Ethan still did not move. The billionaire slowly placed the fountain pen on top of the document instead of signing it. His calm voice broke the silence. "Why did you say that?" Every eye turned toward Claire. She understood that one careless sentence could cost her job before the afternoon was over. She chose her words carefully. Because that page does not look the way I expected it to. One of Ethan's attorneys frowned immediately. Miss, with all due respect, these agreements have been reviewed for weeks by multiple legal teams. Claire nodded politely. I believe that. I am not questioning anyone's work. Then what exactly are you questioning? Another attorney asked, unable to hide his irritation. Claire looked only at Ethan. I noticed a clause that reminded me of something I have seen before. That is all. Victor folded his hands together again, his smile never leaving his face. Mr. Caldwell, we are all under significant time pressure. Reporters are waiting outside. Investors expect an announcement before the market closes. Surely we should not delay because a hotel employee happened to glimpse one paragraph. Ethan remained surprisingly still. Throughout his career, he had learned that the loudest voices often demanded speed, while the wisest decisions usually required patience. His father had repeated one lesson throughout his childhood. If someone insists you must decide immediately, that is usually the best moment to slow down. The memory returned with unexpected clarity. Ethan slid the agreement back toward himself and quietly asked his lead attorney, would you please turn to the section referenced in this paragraph? The attorney hesitated for only a moment before opening the thick binder. There is no need, Victor interrupted smoothly. It is simply standard emergency governance language. Ethan looked at him with a calm expression. If it is standard, reviewing it will only take a minute. Nobody argued. The attorney began flipping through page after page while another legal advisor searched the digital version on his tablet. Claire quietly stepped back toward the wall, wishing she could disappear again. She had already said more than she ever intended. Her responsibility had ended the moment Ethan chose not to sign. Whatever happened next belonged to the people around the table. Yet she noticed something that made her curiosity grow even stronger. The attorney seated beside Victor had begun adjusting his necktie repeatedly, though the conference room was comfortably cool. Tiny beads of perspiration appeared near his temple despite the steady air conditioning. Across the table, Ethan watched the page search continue without saying a word. The room that had felt effortless only minutes earlier now carried a different atmosphere. Nobody reached for coffee. Nobody checked a telephone. Even the assistants stood perfectly still near the walls. Finally, Ethan's lead attorney located the reference section. He adjusted his glasses and quietly began reading. After only 2 sentences, his confident expression changed almost imperceptibly. His eyebrows drew together. He stopped reading aloud. Then he turned back several pages before returning to the same clause once more, as though hoping he had misunderstood it the first time. Ethan noticed the hesitation immediately. Continue, he said calmly. The attorney swallowed before speaking again. This time his voice lacked the certainty it had carried throughout the meeting. Several executives exchanged puzzled glances, while Victor's polite smile faded just enough for Claire to notice. For the first time that afternoon, the billionaire no longer looked at the signature line. He looked directly at the words everyone else had been so eager for him to ignore. The attorney adjusted his glasses once more before clearing his throat. His voice, confident only moments earlier, now carried unmistakable caution. Mr. Caldwell, this provision references temporary executive authority in the event of what is described as an operational continuity trigger. Ethan remained silent. Explain it in plain English, he said. The attorney hesitated. If the conditions listed in Section 42 are activated, certain decision-making powers would temporarily transfer to a joint oversight committee until a review period is completed. Ethan looked down at the page. And who appoints this committee? The room grew noticeably quieter. The attorney turned another page, his fingers moving far more slowly than before. According to this agreement, the initial appointments would be made by both merging parties. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Meaning? Another attorney answered before his colleague could. Meaning Northbridge would receive equal influence over executive decisions immediately after closing, regardless of future board approvals. Several executives exchanged confused glances. One member of Ethan's leadership team leaned forward and whispered, "That language was not in the draft we reviewed last Friday." Victor Harlan responded almost instantly with a calm smile. It reflects the latest recommendations from both legal teams. Nothing unusual. We simply refined governance procedures. Ethan did not respond. Instead, he reached for the complete binder and slowly began turning pages himself. Unlike many executives, he actually enjoyed reading contracts. His father had once told him that numbers built companies, but words determined who owned them. As Ethan followed the cross-references one by one, he discovered something increasingly uncomfortable. The clause did not appear dangerous by itself. Each sentence seemed reasonable when read alone. Yet together they created a chain of authority that could quietly shift control during almost any significant operational challenge. A cybersecurity incident, a regulatory investigation, even an unexpected market disruption. Events that large corporations routinely experienced every year. Ethan looked up. Who inserted this revision? Silence answered him. Every attorney glanced toward someone else. No one spoke first. Claire watched from the far side of the room without moving. She wished she had never become part of the meeting. Yet she also understood that something larger than a simple legal misunderstanding was unfolding before her eyes. Victor folded his hands together again. Surely we are discussing wording rather than substance. Ethan calmly closed the binder. Words are substance. His answer landed softly, yet nobody challenged it. One of Ethan's senior legal advisors quickly opened an earlier electronic draft stored on his tablet. His fingers moved rapidly across the screen before stopping. His expression changed immediately. This clause is different. Another attorney leaned closer. Different how? He swallowed before answering. The reference numbers were changed yesterday evening. The previous version required unanimous approval from both boards before temporary authority could be activated. This version removes that safeguard. A quiet murmur spread. Around the conference table, several executives reached for their own copies, comparing pages one after another. Victor finally lost the effortless confidence he had maintained throughout the afternoon. There must have been a formatting error during document consolidation. Ethan met his eyes steadily. Formatting errors do not rewrite governance authority. No one replied. The weight of those words settled heavily over the room. Outside the conference center, reporters continued waiting, unaware that the announcement had stopped completely. Telephones began vibrating across the table as assistants received questions from public relations teams asking why the ceremony had been delayed. Nobody answered. Ethan slowly turned toward his lead counsel. I want every revision log from the past 72 hours. Every email related to this agreement. Every track change. Before anyone signs anything. Immediately, the attorney replied, already gathering documents. Claire quietly reached for the empty coffee cups scattered across the conference table, hoping to leave unnoticed now that her part was over. As she lifted Ethan's untouched cup, he looked toward her for only a brief moment. It was not the glance of a billionaire looking at hotel staff. It was the look of someone realizing that the only person who had questioned the document before the signature had not been an executive, an attorney, or a consultant. It had been the quiet waitress everyone else had forgotten was standing in the room. No one left the conference room. The scheduled announcement had quietly disappeared from everyone's priorities, replaced by something far more important. Ethan Caldwell remained seated at the head of the table while his legal team spread printed drafts across the polished walnut surface. Colored tabs, handwritten notes, and digital tablets gradually replaced the carefully staged presentation that had been prepared for the cameras outside. The room no longer looked like a celebration. It looked like an investigation. Claire Bennett gently placed the last empty coffee cup onto her serving cart and reached for the handle, hoping to slip through the doorway without drawing. Another glance. Before she could move, Ethan spoke without raising his voice. Miss Bennett. She stopped immediately. Every person in the room turned toward her once again. Would you stay for a few more minutes? Ethan asked. Claire hesitated. I do not want to interrupt your meeting, sir. You already changed it, Ethan answered quietly. Now I would like to understand why. She nodded politely and remained near the wall, keeping both hands folded in front of her apron. She still looked like the same waitress who had entered the room an hour earlier. Only the way people looked at her had changed. Across the table, Ethan's chief legal officer connected a laptop to the conference room display. A timeline of document revisions appeared on the large screen. Every version carried electronic timestamps, editor names, and tracked modifications. One attorney slowly compared the final agreement with the approved draft from the previous week. Another searched internal correspondence for authorization records. The room filled only with the soft clicking of keyboards and the turning of paper. Finally, one associate broke the silence. Here. Everyone looked toward him. He enlarged one revision history on the screen. Section 42 was modified at 8:23 last night. Ethan leaned forward. Approved by whom? The associate frowned. There is no approval attached. Another attorney looked up from his tablet. That should not be possible. Governance revisions require written authorization from both executive legal teams before publication. Ethan folded his hands together. Yet somehow it happened. The attorneys exchanged uneasy looks. Victor Harlan remained remarkably composed, but Claire noticed that he no longer met Ethan's eyes as naturally as before. Instead, he focused on the screen, occasionally adjusting the cuff of his expensive suit jacket. His calm smile had disappeared entirely. Ethan continued watching the revision history. Can we identify the user account? One technician answered almost immediately. Yes. The edits originated from an internal legal administrator account. Who controls that account? Another pause followed. Multiple people have authorized access. Ethan nodded slowly. Then we narrow it down. The atmosphere inside the conference room grew quieter still. Nobody argued anymore. Nobody suggested continuing with the signing ceremony. The evidence had already changed the direction of the afternoon. Claire listened carefully while trying not to become part of the discussion. She understood contracts only through painful experience, not formal education. Years earlier, she had spent countless evenings reading legal documents beside her father after his business collapsed, trying to understand how ordinary words could quietly reshape an entire future. She had learned that dangerous agreements rarely announced themselves. They hid inside familiar language, waiting for someone too confident to read one page twice. Ethan finally looked toward her again. You said the wording reminded you of something you had seen before. Claire answered honestly. My father owned a manufacturing company in Ohio. He trusted people he had worked with for years. One agreement transferred temporary authority during financial hardship. He believed it was routine. 6 months later, he no longer controlled the business he built. Nobody interrupted her. Did he sue? One executive asked softly. Claire shook her head. The contract was legal. He had signed it. The words settled heavily across the room because everyone understood their meaning. Legal did not always mean fair. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the unsigned agreement resting before him. His father's fountain pen still lay exactly where he had placed it, untouched. For the first time all afternoon, he smiled very slightly. It was not a smile of relief. It was gratitude mixed with realization. Sometimes experience arrived wearing an expensive suit. Sometimes it arrived carrying a silver coffee pot. The room fell quiet again as another attorney suddenly looked up from his computer with widened eyes. Mr. Caldwell, he said carefully, I think we just found who uploaded the revised document. And I do not believe this was an accident. The conference room remained completely still as the attorney enlarged the audit log on the large display. Every revision, every timestamp, every user credential appeared in orderly rows that no one could argue with. Ethan Caldwell stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the screen without saying a word. His measured footsteps echoed softly across the polished floor. The attorney pointed toward one highlighted entry. The revised governance clause was uploaded using an administrator account at 8:23 last night. The account credentials were authenticated through a secure terminal inside Northbridge Technologies. Victor Harlan immediately straightened in his chair. That proves nothing, he said evenly. Several outside consultants had temporary access during final document preparation. Ethan nodded once. Continue. The attorney clicked another window. We traced the authentication sequence. The administrator account opened only one file. This agreement. No other documents were modified before or afterward. Another member of Ethan's legal team quietly added. The previous approved version was automatically archived 12 minutes before the replacement file appeared. The room fell silent again. There was no dramatic accusation. There did not need to be. Facts carried their own weight. Victor remained composed, but the confidence that had surrounded him all afternoon had quietly disappeared. He glanced toward the attorney seated beside him, who avoided eye contact entirely. Ethan noticed the exchange without commenting. Years of leading negotiations had taught him that silence often revealed more than confrontation ever could. One by one, Everyone around the table began reviewing the digital records themselves. Nobody questioned the timestamps. Nobody questioned the electronic signatures attached to each revision. The evidence spoke with calm precision. Claire Bennett watched from near the conference room door, wishing she could become invisible once more. She had never imagined that a single whispered sentence would lead to forensic document analysis involving executives and corporate attorneys. She still held the silver coffee pot in one hand, almost forgetting it was there. Ethan turned toward her unexpectedly. "Miss Bennett." She looked up. "When you saw that paragraph, how were you certain enough to stop me?" Claire lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "I was not certain, sir." Several executives looked surprised. Ethan simply listened. "I only recognized a pattern," she continued quietly. "Years ago, my father believed one paragraph could not possibly change everything. He signed anyway because people he trusted told him it was standard language. Later, we discovered that every important decision had already been hidden inside references to other sections." She paused for a moment. "Since then, whenever I read anything important, I never stop at the sentence in front of me. I always look for what it points to." Nobody interrupted. Even the attorneys seemed thoughtful now. Ethan looked back at the unsigned agreement resting on the conference table. His father's fountain pen still lay across the final page exactly where he had placed it. He smiled faintly, almost to himself. "My father used to tell me something similar," he said. "He always said the smallest print usually protects the biggest consequences." Claire returned a polite smile, but said nothing. She did not believe she had done anything extraordinary. She had simply refused to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that everyone else had dismissed. Another notification appeared on the large screen. Ethan's chief legal officer opened the message immediately. After reading only a few lines, he looked toward Ethan with quiet satisfaction. The Information Technology Department confirmed that surveillance records matched the document access logs. The revised file was uploaded after the authorized legal review had officially ended. The compliance team has already preserved every record. Ethan nodded slowly. "Then there will be no signing today." No one objected. Victor closed his leather portfolio without speaking. Around the room, executives who had expected to celebrate a historic merger instead found themselves reflecting on how close they had come to overlooking a decision hidden behind ordinary words. Claire gently placed the untouched coffee pot back onto the serving cart. She believed her shift would finally continue as normal. She reached for the cart handle and quietly turned toward the door. Before she could leave, Ethan's calm voice stopped her once again. "Miss Bennett," he said, looking directly at her with unmistakable respect. "There is one more question I have been wanting to ask ever since you walked into this room. Who taught you to notice what everyone else missed?" Claire Bennett rested both hands lightly on the polished handle of the serving cart before answering. She did not seem embarrassed by the attention, nor did she appear eager to receive it. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle. "My father did." Ethan Caldwell watched her without interruption. Around the conference table, every conversation faded into silence once again. Claire continued. "He never attended law school. He never worked in finance. He owned a small manufacturing company outside Columbus, Ohio. Every evening after dinner, he would spread contracts across the kitchen table and tell me something that sounded strange when I was a little girl." She smiled faintly as though hearing his voice again. "He used to say, 'Claire, important papers never hide their biggest secrets in the biggest paragraphs. They hide them in the references that everyone is too busy to read.'" Ethan listened carefully. When the business failed, he blamed himself. Not because someone deceived him, but because he stopped asking one more question before signing. Claire looked toward the conference table where Ethan's unsigned agreement still rested beneath his father's fountain pen. "After that happened, I started reading every document I could find. Insurance forms, loan agreements, employment contracts, lease agreements. I never wanted another piece of paper to surprise someone I cared about." One of Ethan's senior attorneys spoke quietly. "Did you study law?" Claire gently shook her head. "No. I completed 2 years studying business analytics at Ohio State before my mother became ill. I left school and started working. Life simply moved in another direction." There was no sadness in her voice, only acceptance. Ethan noticed something that impressed him even more than her observation skills. She never exaggerated her knowledge. She never claimed to be an expert. She simply understood the value of paying attention. The chief legal officer slowly closed his laptop. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "the compliance team has confirmed that the altered language violated our approval procedures. The signing cannot proceed under any circumstance today." Ethan nodded. "Notify the board that negotiations are suspended until every revision has been independently reviewed." Immediately, Victor Harlan quietly gathered his documents. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed uncertain of what to say. He finally stood and offered Ethan a restrained nod. "I understand your decision. We will cooperate fully with the review." Ethan returned the nod with professional courtesy. "I appreciate that." There was no accusation in his voice. No public humiliation, only calm responsibility. One by one, executives collected their briefcases and left the conference room with unusually thoughtful expressions. Reporters waiting outside would soon learn that the announcement had been postponed, but very few would ever understand the real reason. Within minutes, only Ethan, his legal team, and Claire remained inside the quiet room. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the walnut table where untouched coffee cups had long since grown cold. Ethan slowly picked up his father's fountain pen before placing it back inside its leather case. "I have carried this pen to every major signing for almost 15 years, he said softly. "Today is the first time I have been grateful that it never touched the paper." Claire offered a respectful smile. "Sometimes waiting is the best decision a signature can make." Ethan looked at her for a long moment before quietly laughing. It was not the laughter of a billionaire celebrating another successful negotiation. It was the laughter of someone realizing he had almost ignored the most valuable advice in the room simply because of the uniform worn by the person giving it. He walked toward Claire and extended his hand. She hesitated only briefly before shaking it. "Miss Bennett," he said, "today you protected something far more valuable than a transaction. You protected trust. That cannot be measured on a balance sheet." Claire answered honestly, "I only hoped you would look one more time." Ethan smiled. "That is exactly what real integrity sounds like." He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a simple business card. There was no dramatic gesture, no oversized reward. He placed the card gently on the serving cart beside the folded linen napkins. "If you ever decide that you would like to finish the education you set aside, or if you ever wish to work with people whose job is to ask difficult questions before important decisions are made, call me. Not because you saved me today, but because you earned my respect before anyone knew your name." Claire looked down at the card without immediately picking it up. She had spent years serving people who noticed only the coffee she carried. That afternoon, someone had finally noticed the quiet judgment she carried instead. The following Monday morning, the Grand Lexington Hotel looked exactly as it always had. Fresh flowers decorated the marble lobby. Business travelers hurried toward elevators with coffee in one hand and telephones in the other. Soft piano music drifted through the entrance, while sunlight reflected across the polished floors. Nothing about the building suggested that only 3 days earlier a decision inside one conference room had quietly changed the course of a billion-dollar agreement. Claire Bennett adjusted the sleeves of her familiar white uniform, tied her apron behind her back, and greeted the breakfast guests with the same warm smile she offered every morning. She did not tell anyone what had happened. She did not mention Ethan Caldwell. She did not show anyone the business card resting inside the small notebook she carried in her locker. To her, Monday still meant fresh coffee, clean tables, and remembering which guests preferred cream instead of milk. Around 10 o'clock, the restaurant manager hurried toward the dining room, looking unusually nervous. "Claire," he called softly, "someone is asking for you." She looked up in surprise. Waiting near the entrance stood Ethan Caldwell, wearing a charcoal gray suit without the group of attorneys or executives who usually surrounded him. He carried no cameras, no reporters, and no assistants. Only a slim leather folder rested beneath one arm. Several employees recognized him immediately, but he quietly declined the special table the manager rushed to prepare. "I am only here for a few minutes," he said politely. Claire approached with the same calm expression she always wore while serving guests. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan smiled. "I was hoping you would simply call me Ethan." She nodded politely. "Good morning, Ethan." He reached into the leather folder and removed a single envelope. "I promised myself that if the investigation confirmed what we suspected, I would personally return here." Claire accepted the envelope without opening it. "The review is complete?" Ethan nodded. Every unauthorized revision was identified. The agreement has been completely rewritten. Every safeguard restored. My board approved the corrected version yesterday. Claire smiled gently. I am glad everyone had another chance to read it. Ethan laughed quietly. You still describe it that way. She looked at him with genuine curiosity. Is there another way to describe it? Ethan paused before answering. Most people would say you saved a merger. Claire slowly shook her head. No. I only reminded someone to slow down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Guests continued eating breakfast around them, unaware that an extraordinary conversation was taking place only a few feet away. Ethan finally gestured toward the envelope. You should open it. Inside, Claire found a letter from the Caldwell Foundation together with documentation establishing a full scholarship covering the remaining tuition needed to complete her degree in business analytics, including books, academic expenses, and flexible scheduling support, so she could continue working if she chose. There was also a handwritten note beneath the official letter. It read, "The world already has enough people who know how to sign contracts. It needs more people who know when not to." Claire quietly folded the note and looked back at Ethan. Thank you. He smiled. Do not thank me. Consider it an investment in someone who understands that attention is more valuable than assumption. Before leaving, Ethan extended his hand once more. This time the gesture felt less like gratitude and more like respect shared between equals. After he walked away, Claire carefully returned the letter to its envelope and placed it inside her locker. Minutes later, she carried another tray of coffee into the dining room exactly as she had every other day. Most guests never recognized her. Most never knew what had happened inside the conference room upstairs. Yet that no longer mattered. Claire had never wanted applause. She only wanted people to avoid the kind of regret her father had carried for years. Outside, the city moved with its usual speed, chasing deadlines, meetings, and signatures. Inside the quiet restaurant, one waitress continued serving coffee with the same steady hands, proving that wisdom does not announce itself with titles, wealth, or applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, notices what everyone else overlooks, and leaves behind nothing more than a better decision. Because in the end, the strongest voice in any room is often the one that never needed to be the loudest.